Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our next panel titled Endgame, Diplomacy and Strategic Affairs in India. Our speakers for this round are Arjun Subramaniam, Senior Faculty Member at National Defence College in Delhi; Amit Dasgupta, former Indian diplomat, author and educator; Sandeep Unnithan, Executive Editor, India Today and author, in conversation with Manjeet Kripalani, former journalist and co-founder and executive director of Gateway House. Before they delve into perspectives on national security, diplomacy, and military strategy, here are a few words on each. Amit Dasgupta is an Indian diplomat who has served in various capacities in Cairo, Brussels, Kathmandu, Berlin, Sydney, and New Delhi. He is presently posted in Manila. He has authored and edited a number of books, including Indian by Choice and India for a Billion Reasons. Sandeep Unnithan is the executive editor of India Today in New Delhi, where he writes on security-related issues. He is the author of Black Tornado, The Three Sieges of Mumbai 2611. Arjun Subramaniam is a serving Air Vice Marshal in the Indian Air Force. He is an accomplished fighter pilot and has commanded a MiG-21 squadron and a large flying base. He has a PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies and is a prolific writer and speaker on military history, air power, and national security. He is currently a faculty member at the National Defence College in Delhi and is the author of India's Wars, A Military History, 1947 to 71. Manjeet Kripalani is a co-founder and executive director of Gateway House, Indian Council on Global Relations. Prior to the founding of Gateway House, Manjeet was India Bureau Chief of Business Week magazine from 1996 to 2009. During her extensive career in journalism, she has won several awards. She is a member of the Asian Advisory Board of the International Center for Journalists and the Overseas Press Club, and she sits on the executive board of a number of non-profit organizations. Welcome to all on our esteemed panel, and over to you, Manjeet.
Thanks, Usra, very much, and welcome all of you to this wonderful edition of the Kalagura Festival. We're really pleased to be here, and welcome Amit. Perfect timing, gentlemen. So Amit, I'm going to start with you first. The session is called the End Game. What are the three broad trends today that impact in global politics that impacts India today?
I think the three, one which I think has suddenly crept into the equation. Can you hear me?
Oh. Yes.
One has crept into the equation very recently, which is the assumption of the US presidency by Donald Trump. That would be, to my mind, a very, very critical input to the equation. The second is the global economy and the kind of role countries would play either in enhancing economic growth and development or in actually pulling it back. And the third is the kind of impact terrorism would have on the global scenario, including the impact it can have not only on the relations between countries, but on economics in general. So these, to my mind, would be the three broad parameters. Naturally, there would be the shadow of several players in the game, the shadow of China, for instance, and the disputes in the South China Seas, the implications of the growth of the ISIS as an organization, but apart from that, several other radical organizations across the globe, uncertainties as a consequence of Brexit, serious uncertainties in terms of how US politics is going to play out in the international arena. So these would be overarching, but the three main ones are the ones I've already mentioned to you.
And these could be also viewed as opportunities for India and the world that we inhabit. This is our 70th year of independence. It's 70 years after the Second World War. Can we, instead of looking at these as problems, how can we look at these as opportunities? How can this not be an end game, but the beginning of something else?
Look, I'm not really a very, very optimistic person, purely for the sake of looking at an opportunity. I do believe that we are confronting an extremely serious challenge on all fronts. Foreign policy is a matter of pursuing your strategic interests, but I think we need to recognize that there are severe strategic constraints that hold us back. And therefore, while it's a good thing to try and see what opportunities might play themselves out, it's also useful to be realistic and not jump the gun. For example, I don't think I would immediately see extraordinary opportunities with Donald Trump having become the President of the United States. I would be extremely cautious because he has actually inserted into the equation one element which bothers any foreign policy or security analyst, which is uncertainty. You cannot predict the next step. And if you cannot predict it, it becomes extremely complicated.
And Arjun, this is the good way to segue into you. He says you cannot, with uncertainty, you cannot predict the next step. Isn't that a good thing in terms of the way militaries work? And if we have so much uncertainty today, what are the lessons we can learn from the past, particularly for India, about uncertainty?
I would actually share Amit's realism even when it comes to uncertainty with regards to military affairs. Let me just take you back. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen warfare changing so rapidly. We had something known as third generation warfare that lasted for a long, long time, from the end of World War II to the Gulf Wars, wherein things were quite predictable. But suddenly, over the last 2 decades, we've had third generation warfare transiting to fourth generation warfare, immediately to fifth generation warfare. And even fifth generation warfare is seeing a complete change today, wherein from networks and groups of entities, you have something like lone wolf attacks, which are becoming a rule rather than an exception. So uncertainty for soldiers and uncertainty for established militaries is also extremely disconcerting, because militaries traditionally train for conventional conflict. And over the years, they've been asked to adapt themselves to sub-conventional conflict. And now they're being asked to adapt to a host of opportunities, what we call full spectrum conflict. So, an armed forces like India has to look at conventional capability, because we have 2 very, very conventionally strong adversaries. But at the same time, we've got to look at the entire spectrum of conflict below conventional conflict, which is terrorism, which is hybrid warfare, which are insurgencies. So uncertainty is here to stay, and I think it's a big challenge for militaries. Now, looking at the past, one of the, I think, infirmities in our strategic culture is our neglect of contemporary Indian military history. And let me amplify a little bit on that. After independence, conventional Indian historical discourse has been dominated by political, social, cultural, and economic historians. And military history has been something of a sideshow, because it was seen primarily as a legacy of our colonial past. But actually, if you look at what's happened in independent India, and the number of times that India's armed forces and security forces have had to step in order to plug fissures and cracks, you will see that other than the United States and Israel, no other country has had to use force, albeit with extreme circumspection and restraint, in order to ensure that the Indian democracy survives. So I think force and India's armed forces have played a very important role in preserving our cultural fabric, our democracy, and things like that. So I think it's important that Indians read more about military history, not because you want to, not because of any kind of a chest thumping requirement, but because if you understand India's military and you look at it, with the fresh perspective, you will realize that it's an intrinsic part of India's democratic culture. And so I think military history is something that needs to be studied with far greater seriousness if we want to develop a well-rounded strategic culture.
And also because we've always studied our own history through British eyes. This is now for the first time that people like all of you on the stage are writing about India through Indian eyes and the Indian lens, and so that makes it even more important.
You couldn't be closer to the truth, Manjeet, because we relied too much on our colonial past for lessons for the future. But in 1947, if you look at the first conflict that the Indian Armed Forces had to face, the first regiment that moved into Kashmir was a Sikh battalion. You had a whole lot of cultural diaspora in India's armed forces fighting that war. And if you were to look at a manifestation of the truly multicultural and multi-ethnic flavor of India, you need to look no further than the kind of people who fought the 1947 and 48 war. You had Sikhs, you had Christians, you had Jews, you had, the Zojila Pass at over 12,000 feet was opened by a group of Madras Engineering Regiment, and the poor blighters had never ever seen snow. But what they did was that so that's India for you. And I think that's what we've got to learn from contemporary Indian history.
Sandeep, talking about uncertainty, so let's look at ourselves geographically at this moment. On India's west, there is chaos and conflict. So you've got Pakistan, Syria, Daesh, West Asia, and to our east is connectivity and cooperation, right? OBOR, One Belt, One Road. What are our options? Where are we looking?
Well, Manjeet, now, as you mentioned, West Asia is the present government's, one of the present government's biggest achievements has been in foreign policy. In the last 3 years, you're seeing a very different kind of foreign policy at work. Ambassador Dasgupta's colleagues, the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the NSA. You're seeing a very outcome-driven foreign policy for the first time. And West Asia has been one of the great achievements of this government. Reaching out to the GCC countries has been a remarkable achievement of this government, getting them on our side on various issues, especially on terrorism, which is a big concern for us. Now, the reasons are not very far to see because the United States has become it's become energy self-sufficient, and in a couple of years, it's going to be an exporter of energy. We are the largest market that is so close to the GCC countries for both buying their hydrocarbons and for investments. But having said that, when you look at the conflict that's on in Iraq and Syria and Yemen, there's a kind of hands-off approach which I'm unable to understand. For instance, I'm unable to understand why we don't have an ambassador in Baghdad for the last 6 months. There's no military advisor there in Iraq. And Iraq is our second largest supplier of, petroleum. That baffles me. And the other aspect is that why is it that we are unable to help any of the GCC countries, the countries that are, in this conflict, in Syria and Yemen and in Iraq? Couldn't we just set up a field hospital, for instance, in all of these countries which are being attacked, day and night by, terrorists and Daesh or Al-Qaeda, whatever you have it, because we enjoy a very unique position in the world today. I think we are probably the only country in the world which is friends with the Gang of Three. So that's Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. I mean, these are dead. They're virtually at each other's throats. It's like it's a hate triangle, but we are good friends with all of them. But surprisingly, there's been a hands-off approach, and I don't understand the reasons for that. I mean, like I mentioned, why we are not able to reach out to countries that we've had traditionally very good relations with, Iraq and in Syria. I will ask you that later, sir. But so there has been an attempt to kind of firewall us from, firewall our vulnerable populations from the lure of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. I see that as one of the major concerns. Now, if you look east, the One Belt, One Road, and the CPEC, which is a byproduct of the One Belt, One Road policy, which has been taken up by Xi Jinping as, a mission statement virtually. That is something that is of far greater concern to us because for the first time you have a China-Pakistan axis which directly, strategically threatens us, which is so close that we're calling it the Chipak. It's like in Hindi you say Chipakna, so it's like Chipak now. It's on our doorsteps. It's there for us to see. And in a couple of years, you will have this China-Pakistan economic corridor that passes through territory that is claimed by India, which is Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, which effectively seals this entire dispute that we've had. It's like China has entered this traditional 70-year dispute that we've had with Pakistan, and which kind of manifests their actions even as we speak now, which is protecting their terrorist groups and leaders like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Toiba. It's unbelievable that a P5 country could be repeatedly, shooting down our attempts to declare, the Jaish-e-Mohammed chief as a designated global terrorist. It's translated into military sales. I mean, this is probably the only instance of one country transferring bomb blueprints, atomic weapon blueprints, missile blueprints, know-how, hardware, submarines on a very large scale, which, their approach has been to kind of firewall India and South Asia, and they've been using Pakistan to do that. And unfortunately, it has taken this thing of supporting terrorism even. So that, to my mind, is a much, much bigger threat to us than, what events in West Asia that's happening.
Do you think it's just revenge for India not allowing China access to India's market officially?
I mean, there's no question of them not having access to them. They are our single largest trading partner. It's over $50 billion, and it's heavily in their favor. So there's no question of them not having markets, not having access to our markets. In fact, it's the other way around, because we have been asking for access to the Chinese markets, especially in IT and in software and all, which they have been, protective about, and, they don't discuss all of that. So, it's taken a very hostile, attitude in the last couple of weeks. If you've noticed, Global Times has been really going after India in a way that we've not seen before. It's like almost daily statements on nuclear tests or, missile tests or Pakistan or terrorism, or the approach being that, this is the reality, you got to live with it. That's what they say about protecting, say, the Jaish-e-Mohammed in the UN.
So, Ambassador, why do you think we don't have a diplomat in Baghdad or a military representative? And why are we unable to resolve our issues with China, especially given that our foreign secretary is a China expert?
Okay, let me just start with China first, and take you back to what I had mentioned about uncertainty. For over 7 decades, we've tried to deal with Pakistan as a country that we would negotiate, discuss, etc. And to my mind, it is always important for any negotiator to recognize who actually is negotiating. And I think the equation has suddenly become very clear to us that the true negotiator for Pakistan is Beijing. And if you want to talk to Islamabad, you actually need to talk to Beijing, which means that your equations with Beijing need to be recrafted. Now, if you look at the past 60 or 70 years, we have always been accommodating with regard to Beijing's concerns and interests. India has been actually very, very reticent about doing anything that upsets Beijing. This unilateral, let's say, appeasement has never had reciprocity from China's end. Yesterday, I think it was only yesterday that one of the Indian origin professors in the US decided to invite His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the US university to give a talk. If you see the language that has been used in trying to criticize this action, the connection is not just between an Indian origin American. The connection is to say that this is how India is intemperate in the manner in which it conducts foreign policy. I think one needs to recognize that the Chinese believe in something which they refer to as mianze, which is losing face. So face is very, very important to them. But it's important to them as far as they are concerned. If you were to make comments regarding either Taipei or talk about the South China Sea dispute, they ask you to read history. And the most critical thing to my mind is to be able to recognize finally that talking to Islamabad doesn't work unless you first negotiate your relationship with Beijing. On the first aspect that you mentioned with regard to Iraq, etc., I believe that the situation is extremely complicated. For the simple reason that for several years, we saw that entire region as one where Indian workers would go and actually earn a living, their remittances would impact our GDP, but that's only how we saw it. We are aware of the huge amount of scandals that took place where workers were ill-treated and cheated, not only in the host country, but actually by our own people prior to their departure and on their return. That entire region, as far as the Indian community is concerned, was never really relevant to us other than as a source of revenue through remittances. All of a sudden, the situation has changed. It's changed dramatically by the insertion of not only a very strong Shia-Sunni warfare, but also the role that they are playing as a result of Europe's breakup, migration of people across, the growth of terrorism, the play that has drawn in Moscow, Beijing, Washington, and most certainly Europe. And it is in this complicated relationship that India now needs to ask itself, does it sit at the high table and play the game? Is it competent to do so? Or does it just work out where it's able to be effective rather than just insist on being at the dining table?
And militarily, how does this pan out? Why can we not even have a military? There's been a lot of discussion in the past about India participating, as you said, but we never did. And you're right, we firewall our workers, but surely there can be a policy beyond that. What does the military say?
India's policy as far as the military is concerned right after independence, and I think it's a pretty sound one, revolves around deterrence. And deterrence with a certain amount of restraint. In the military and as far as the policy is concerned, we have never been expeditionary in our outlook. India doesn't covet going into anybody else's territory unless called upon to do so. And like, for example, when we went into the Maldives or we went into Sri Lanka, it was explicitly on the invitation or on the request of that particular government. We have a fairly long boundary to look after. And for those of you who would like to believe that there is a constant state of tension between on the India-China as far as the line of actual control is concerned, since 1967, not a shot has been fired across the India-China line of actual control. So there is effective deterrence that prevails. And as far as China is concerned, China is playing for time. And I think you need to play along. I mean, so you need to build capability. And until one builds adequate capability, I don't think we should harbor any great aspirations of being on the high table. We need to consolidate. We need to consolidate inside. And we need to look at building comprehensive national power before one aspires to really go on the high table. It's a fashion statement across the world to say that India is now ready to be at the high table. But I think we need to look inwards. That are we ready, or do we need to build capability first? Do we need to look inwards, and do we need to gradually build capability? That's what Hillary Clinton also a couple of years ago mentioned, and immediately there was a response to say that is this a way of drawing India into the international scene and overstretching itself? So these are the kind of questions that militarily one has to look at.
Sandeep, do you agree?
Well,
What would you do?
Well, I'll give you the other perspective, what the Americans think about this. The US ambassador had come to our office a couple of weeks back, and he was talking about this, about India's role on the high table. And he says that, every time we ask some kind of assistance, from India, whether you can, contribute here or there or something, he says that there is a complete, we hit a wall in India. And it's almost like India does not want to venture into certain relationships, or even the military relationship, to get something like the LEMOA, the logistics agreement, that took 10 years to figure out. So he says that India is always playing coy. So the view in Washington is that why are we going out on a limb for India, because it doesn't really commit resources or stick its neck out on the international stage when it really matters. The flip side to that is that one of the most sensible decisions made in the 21st century, it's like a foreign policy breakthrough by India, was one of inaction, which is in 2003. I'm sure you're aware of this, when there was tremendous American pressure on the Prime Minister of the day and the government. The government was virtually divided down the middle about sending troops to Iraq. Now, the Americans had said that you have to send troops as part of this coalition. The Indian army was ready. Surprisingly, that earmarked a division to deploy in Iraq. And at the very last minute, the Prime Minister intervened, and he actually engineered some kind of protests by the left front parties. That's Prime Minister Vajpayee for you. He called the left front and he said, I don't hear your protests loud enough. And when the left started protesting, he went and told the Americans, sorry, no can do. I can't deploy troops, that's how it is. So, that has really saved us, So there's two ways of looking at it, actually. This, when Air Marshal Subramaniam mentioned this thing about us not going abroad unless it's at the request of a foreign country. The invasion of Iraq is probably the biggest disaster of the 21st century.
Yeah, I just thought lest there be an impression that the Indian military is apprehensive about venturing overseas. Our contribution to UN peacekeeping has been phenomenal. We are amongst the largest contributors to United Nations peacekeeping across continents, whether it's in Congo, Sierra Leone, Sudan. We were one of the earliest contributors to United Nations peacekeeping in Congo in 1963. So it's not that the Indian military is reticent about of going overseas. It is just that India's policy as such is one of inclusiveness, and we would like to get a consensus before deploying military overseas. And I think that's a policy that has stood the test of time. To say, you look at the kind of engagement that the Indian Navy does these days. 20 years ago, we had a handful of ships going, showing the flag around. Today, you have the Indian Navy furthering maritime diplomacy. We are amongst the most active when it comes to furthering maritime diplomacy.
However, we all know that thanks to the Indian Ocean is no longer ours. It is no longer the Indian Ocean. Thanks, on the pretext of piracy, there are now 44 navies in the Indian Ocean. It is no longer ours. So, it's really a passive military rather than an active military. A military diplomacy without really getting into trouble is okay. But if India wants to be a net security provider, it has to see some action. And if indeed the Navy now is going to be more important than the Army, thankfully, hopefully this government is not going to be as Pakistan-centric as previous governments and will look at other threats as well. Really, do we need a passive Navy that's just playing diplomacy all the time?
No. By no means is the Indian Navy passive, because you see, it's been one of the most active participants in the anti-piracy operations of Somalia.
Maybe, but we still had to cede the space to other navies, and they were waiting for it to happen.
In fact, confrontation on the high seas is very, very rare these days. Again, building naval capability is all about deterrence. And you mentioned about, you mentioned about a maritime mindset vis-a-vis a continental mindset. I think India has to have a balanced posture. Because after all, if you look at it, our principal adversaries or principal threats still focus from the land. We have very large borders with both Pakistan and China, and they are live borders. So I think what we require is a balanced approach, and I think that's what we are doing. We have a very, very balanced approach, and the naval capability is being expanded, and so are the other two services. So I think it's a balanced approach that's a need of the hour.
My take on this is that, I really see no problem in a very large number of countries having their naval ships in the Indian Ocean. Indeed, if we had a very large number of countries with their naval ships in what we call the South China Seas, you wouldn't have that dispute, nor indeed would you have the Chinese getting away by building those islands. But just shift the discussion a little bit and go back to Iraq, etc. To my mind, one of the truly major foreign policy initiatives that is likely to be announced very soon would be the relationship with Israel. It's a relationship which has been built over the years, but for the Indian Prime Minister to go and visit Tel Aviv is, I think, an extremely powerful statement. And I say this because I believe that's a strategic relationship which not only requires consolidation between the foreign ministries and the defense ministries, but it is a relationship that needs to be publicly and visibly acknowledged. And I think that's going to be one of India's truly remarkable foreign policy initiatives over the next year or so. That could shift, to a large extent, the balance.
And given the fact that Mr. Trump now wants to move the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, do we have something to say about that, or?
I think the movement of the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem is not going to happen. These are not things that happen overnight just because somebody makes a statement. I think it's very important to recognize who you're going to negotiate with. That's the first point. If you want to negotiate with Islamabad, as I said, you need to go via Beijing. If you want to negotiate with Washington, you have to find Washington's friends, and their biggest friend is Tel Aviv. So I think I think the manner in which the Indian foreign policy is being crafted keeps India's strategic interests in mind. We need to recognize that just because we have 1.3 billion people, just because our GDP is expected to grow very rapidly, doesn't really make us a global leader. It takes a long time before this happens, and as a Chinese premier once said many years ago, this is the time to put your head down. There will come a time when you can lift your head up. Right now, be quiet, be patient, do your job.
That kind of fits in with what you were saying, Sandeep.
Yeah, I had a very quick point to add to what Mr. Dasgupta said about dealing with are we dealing with the right players in Pakistan, and the road to, Pakistan passes through Beijing. Well, there's another very important player in Pakistan who actually calls the shots, and they live in a city north of Islamabad. It's called Rawalpindi. It's the Pakistan Army. There is no army in the world that controls nuclear weapons and foreign policy the way the Pakistan military does. Pakistan is, in effect, it's a garrison town. It's the whole country is run by the military. And in the last couple of years, we've not been able to communicate our intent to the Pakistan military. I feel we're dealing with the wrong people. Yeah, the road does pass through Beijing, but I feel we have not been able to reach out to the Pakistan military.
If I may, I have a somewhat unconventional view on what bothers Pakistan. For several years, indeed for 70 years, we believe that what bothers Pakistan is partition, and it's Kashmir. To my mind, what bothers Pakistan is the defeat in the 1971 war and the creation of Bangladesh. That is what bothers Pakistan. And it bothers the Pakistani army because we took this brave decision to not court-martial the soldiers there. And when they walked down the streets of Karachi, they were stoned. And I was told by a Pakistani diplomat whose father was in the army that this is something no son can ever forgive. And I think it's very critical for us to recognize that the avenging the creation of Bangladesh, the emergence of a sovereign nation, can only happen if you divide India. And that is the military point of view. What negotiation are we going to do with an army which has or with a group which has actually decided what its Lakshman Rekha is? You can negotiate provided you want to achieve a win-win situation. Someone gives, someone takes. You can negotiate when you know what the other side is willing to talk to you. You cannot negotiate in an atmosphere of complete mistrust. You cannot negotiate at a time where those people or the group that you're sitting across the table says, I'm sorry, it's possible to talk provided you give me this, and without this, nothing moves. I think to a large extent a breakthrough was possible, but I believe that is because the equations had got completely unbalanced. I mean, what happened in the 1971 war is that the 7th Fleet was very close to knocking at our doors. Islamabad no longer enjoys the support of Washington. It needed a new balancing power, and it has it very strongly in Beijing. You have to talk to Beijing, and Beijing can do what needs to be done.
I just want to take on from what Amit mentioned about 1971. You know, there's something that has always baffled me as a historian, and that is when the Indian army took over 90,000 prisoners in Bangladesh, the way in which the Indian army treated them was probably the most impeccable treatment that anybody has done in history. And to my mind, I've always felt that this lack of humiliation after the war should have actually paved the way for some kind of a rapprochement earlier than what, at some point in time. Indian army formations vacated their barracks in order to house Pakistani prisoners. In Bangladesh, the Indian army protected the Pakistani army from lynching mobs. The Indian army allowed the Pakistani army to retain their weapons because they were petrified that they would be lynched by mobs in Dhaka and the other places. So it was absolutely impeccable a treatment of prisoners under the Geneva Convention. And Lieutenant General Thomas Matthews was the para brigade commander, and he had to vacate his barracks for the Pakistani soldiers. And when he narrated this incident to me, and when he was walking through the barracks, there was a surly, bearded Pakistani special forces guy who refused to get up, in deference to a senior officer. So Brigadier Thomas Matthew at that time, Matthew Thomas, he stopped by him and said that, have you forgotten your soldierly behavior? So he said, I haven't got any news from my family back home in Pakistan for weeks. So how do you expect me to be happy? So I mean to say, within 24 hours, General Matthews recollects having got feedback from his family that they were okay, and he passed it on. And that was the kind of treatment that the prisoners got here in India. So I, for one, that's baffled me as to why that has held on and why that hasn't changed the Pakistani army mindset. And I entirely agree with Amit that it is that constant desire to get even after the 1971 defeat, that seems to be a biggest stumbling block.
So moving on to War Made New, Sandeep. So technology has upended everything, right? You've got 3D printers which are printing guns, unmanned weapons, platforms. They'll soon become part of the battlefield, rapid advances being achieved in cloning technology. How is India situated to respond to these technological challenges? And I'll ask each of you this question.
Yeah, Manjeet, very quickly, I don't know if you noticed the Lady Gaga concert at the halftime of the US Football League. What was it? In Texas recently. There was a cloud of drones, if you noticed there, that were painting the American flag. That was just a few days back. So all these drones were operating, in perfect sync with each other, and they formed the American stars and stripes in the sky, in the night sky. It's amazing. On the 8th of January, 2 F-18 aircraft, US fighter planes, launched a cloud of 100 drones, which discharged from the belly of these aircraft, and they flew around. They did 4 different tasks of reconnaissance and surveillance, including forming circles. So they were moving like swarms. This is the next level of technology. Just to tell you that how advanced technologies are being pursued in the world today, especially in the US with the DARPA. I'd like to say we are doing the same in India, but unfortunately we are not. And the story is really, really abysmal, because what we're doing here is we're trying to reinvent the wheel and fit it on a bullock cart, because we have been sanctioned a bullock cart 10 years ago. We will not think of leapfrogging into the future and maybe go for a motor car. The Indian military, pardon my saying this, is the largest buyer of bayonets in the world, bayonets and mules. And this is the 21st century, this is 2017. That is how backward we are technologically. I've been to the line of control 20 years back in 1996. I went there recently last year. In the 20 years, the Indian soldier who stands there, stands guard. It's virtually the knife edge between India and Pakistan, this line of control. The only item of technology that the Jawan has is a mobile phone that he's bought with his own money. That is how bad we are technologically. Now, what is the reason for this? One is, of course, I told you about this bayonet complex. The other one is the Ashoka Lion conundrum. That's what I call it. The magnificent symbols of our republic, the 4 Ashoka lions, looking in 4 directions. Those are actually the DRDO, the Ordnance Factory, the armed forces, and the military bureaucracy. They're all looking in different directions, right? They are the decision makers, the producers, the designers, and the users. They are not in sync. And how it manifests is that this working in silos, one silo does not know what the other is doing. Recently, I saw this beautiful DRDO robot called the Daksh, which is a 8-wheeled robot, autonomous, 500-meter line of sight. You can control it. It can carry a shotgun. It can carry a machine gun even. It's got a claw it can lift like 20 or 40 kgs. It's the perfect kind of robot soldier, the future soldier. So I asked him, what are the kind of orders that you've got? So this young scientist says, well, we've got like 20. The army is buying 20 of them. I said, are you serious? 20 of these robots? He said, yeah, for the whole Indian army, which has something like 350 battalions, they're only buying 20 of these. And these robots, just look at the way you could use them. In the siege of Mumbai, not very far from here, in the hotels, you had commandos rushing into rooms which were held by terrorists, where robots should have been going in. This is the kind of technological blindness that I see around. And it's really, really bad. It's appalling. Unless there's a revolution in military affairs in the Ministry of Defense, I don't see any improvements.
I won't take Sandeep on much of the criticism that he's offered, because it's quite obvious. I'm still serving, and I won't engage in a slanging or a match with him. But I'd like to say that the picture is not as dismal as Sandy points out. Now, Sandy pointed about mules. Now, let me assure you that Sandy's also been to the line of control, and so have I been there are many areas of our line of actual control and our line of control that still need those mules to take those sack of flour and rations to the soldier on the post. Because even if a helicopter wants to go and drop those rations over there, the terrain would ensure that the soldier would not reach those rations because because those bags would fall in ravines and hostile terrain. So that is one issue. The second issue is that Sandy mentioned about mobile phones. Let me assure you that along with mobile phones, there is rapidly an infusion of night vision goggles also. You have some of our, if you go on board some of our ships, you have absolutely state-of-the-art technology which probably the recent Kochi and the Kolkata class destroyers match up with the best that you have in the world. So, there is, while I agree with Sandeep when he says that there's miles to go, but then there is always miles to go before you can sleep, and that's what Robert Frost said almost a century ago, and we still continue. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but there's still miles to go before we can sleep. So, so there is a lot of development taking place, but much still can be done in the innovation cycle, in ensuring, he mentioned about silos, absolutely. We still work in silos, those silos need to converge at some point in the distance. And I think attempts are being made, and particularly this current, and I'm not being politically correct here, but let me assure you that the current government is seized of this challenge. And I think we're working towards that particular direction.
I must confess that I'm technologically a Luddite. I don't understand too much about technology, and I find it very fascinating that you have 3D printers that can actually print a bridge that you can use, weapons, so on and so forth. And I wondered if one day these 3D printers could actually print food, Countries would never starve. But I'm not sure exactly where this technology is actually going. As I see it, and I should very immediately tell you that I'm not a big supporter of huge amounts of expenditure on military. I'm not a supporter of that. I do believe that you need to expend funds on the military in order to at least have the parity that is very much required. Today, much of our ships, much of our military has equipment which is either non-functional or requires repairs, etc. Most certainly you need to upgrade this. But to be able to to take India's entire GDP and start focusing on a huge technological revolution in the armed forces is not something I subscribe to. I subscribe to a system by which India needs to recognize that no matter what people say, 6%, 7%, 8% GDP growth rate, fastest growing, there are poor people. There are people who don't get enough to eat, people who suffer from basic malnutrition, all the problems related to health, sanitation, education, housing, etc. I think the focus of the government needs to be very, very clear on what it is elected to do. At the same time, the borders are sacrosanct. So we need to make this balance in terms of what we are actually trying to achieve. And if 3D printers is the way to go, I'd rather they printed food.
It's a little bit of an argument over low-tech versus high-tech. And there's a place for low-tech, definitely. And I also believe that the world is continuously looking at high-tech when actually countries like ours need quite a lot of low-tech because that's what we can manage. Sandeep, even if we do, so what's wrong with the mule? And really, can't we have both?
Well, the mule is used because we have an invention a couple of centuries back which is called the road. Because there are no roads, they haven't been built in 60 or 70 years on the border for various reasons. It's what I call the reverse scorched earth policy. We didn't build roads on the border because we thought the Chinese would use it to, come in and invade us. So for like 40 or 50 years, we never built roads. which is why we're still using mules. Now, I don't understand why in 2017 you still need mules. I still disagree with you on that, Marshal Subramaniam. I think we need roads.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me assure you that the kind of road building initiatives that are ongoing in the Northeast is actually phenomenal. You just have to go there, you have to go into Assam and you have to go into Arunachal Pradesh to see the kind of effort that is going in to ensure last mile connectivity. So I agree with you, and like I mentioned, you can look at national security as a glass that is half empty or half full. I, as a man on the inside, would like to look at it as a glass half full, whereas Sandy from the outside would like to look at it probably as a glass which is half empty. So it's a question of it's probably the same thing, but with a different focus.
Amit?
Yeah, just on roads, I just wanted to mention, if you as Ashok was saying, that some of the roads in the Northeast are being built in order to take the weight of tanks. I would rather that they were built in order to take the weight of trucks full of goods and services which were moving up and down. We have to get our priorities right. If you want to win your neighbors, it is trade which gets them to become your friend, not military supremacy.
Right. Which brings us
but
back
Amit,
to...
aren't we? But Amit, we are doing that, isn't it? With the terrific amount of effort that the current government and the MEA is looking in our Act East policy, the corridors through Myanmar, Bangladesh connectivity, the BCIM. So I think what we are doing right now is a twin-pronged strategy in the East. One is to provide connectivity so that the military is able to up its deterrence, and the other one is to provide roads to do exactly what you're saying, to enhance connectivity between Bhutan, Bangladesh, India, into Myanmar, so that our entire Act East policy actually gains tremendous amount of momentum, and that's a focus area. I think nobody would know better than you as far as the Look East and the Act East thing is concerned.
May I? I think we go back to Sandy's point, and there I'll just overturn it. Instead of saying we need to do more on the military, we actually need to do more on trade and commerce. And let me give you one basic example. If you're trying to move seafood or perishables from Bangladesh, and you want to bring it to, let's say, Visakhapatnam, it rots in the border because your customs rules and regulations, etc., are so cumbersome. Second, you don't have a system of moving refrigerated cargo. You don't win friends by allowing this kind of thing to continue. Of course we need to do more, but to my mind you need to do more on trade. You need to do more on making other people become wealthier.
And from somebody from a think tank, really what are we doing to build our intellectual capacity in this very area? Because we don't have enough. I think the Commerce Ministry is really sort of doing things on their own, the bureaucrats do it on their own, but we don't have enough intellectual capacity to think about these things, provide ideas, either for geoeconomics or geopolitics. And what are we doing about that?
No, I think this is something that we really and truly need to lament. Look at the city of Mumbai, supposed to be our financial capital, a critical place. You can count the number of think tanks which are in Mumbai. You take the city of Delhi, everyone and his uncle is there. As a net result, you have a very cozy, incestuous relationship being built where one thinker rotates among different organizations, and you have a consolidation rather than a spreading out of thinking. I've always maintained that if you want to discuss the policies vis-a-vis Colombo, you cannot do it in Delhi. You have to go to southern India. If you want to look at Maldives, can I sit down in Delhi really, in Raisina Hill, and work it out? What happens when you want to discuss about Bangladesh or Myanmar? Is that also to be the impact on Assam, on Meghalaya, on West Bengal, on Orissa? Is this not critical? So I think it is critical and important that think tanks like the ones that you represent and people who are around should actually share their views and co-opt, I think, the the recognition that foreign policy cannot be a Delhi-determined intellectual exercise. It is a national aspiration because survival is a national aspiration.
What a wonderful way to close the session. Thank you very much. It's been stimulating and exciting. And I think the idea is that India has to keep its head down, work, and it will emerge. And its ideas will emerge too. Thank you very much.